as someone who talks a lot about conspiracy theorists, I get the question a lot of the... Well, I get told a lot of the time that in reality I'm enslaved. I've enslaved myself, and you just don't see the truth. And there's one guy, Matt Gahillanty, or whatever it is, or we'll just call him Matt. But he sent me this, apparently, and it's the story of my enslavement. And oh my, oh my, oh my, oh my. There is so much wrong with this. So, let's watch this, shall we? The story of my enslavement.
This is the story of your enslavement. How it came to be, and how you can finally be free.
By listening to their side, apparently, and as you'll soon to see, this is what it's all about.
Like all animals, human beings want to dominate and exploit the resources around them.
Because this is how we live. This is how we work. This is how we've evolved throughout thousands of years. Do they care? No. As you'll soon see.
First we mostly hunted and fished and ate off the land, but then something magical.
You mean civilization and evolution? The process of learning and improving ourselves?
And terrible happened to our minds. We became, alone among the animals, afraid of death.
How are we afraid of death? Every single animal has what they call a survival instinct. This is what we have as well. Your survival instinct will automatically kick in any time you are threatened. This is the same for animals. Animals are just as afraid of death as we are. They may not have the higher brain capacity and functions that we do, but animals still have the survival instinct just like we do. They are not going to needlessly throw themselves into harm's danger, to danger if they think they are going to die. They will run away.
And of future loss. And this was the start of a great tragedy, and an even greater possibility. You see, when we become afraid of death, of injury and imprisonment, we become controllable.
Oh, right, okay. They're showing pictures of torture here, which is... It's very manipulative what they've basically done here. They've synced the words with images. But basically, torture is... yeah, it inflicts pain, but however, it's discounting that many people have gone through torture and have come out the other side, and have even become stronger people because they've been tortured. I'm not advocating for torture, but in the many cases of, you know, people who talk to people who are tortured, yes, they've gone through absolutely traumatic experiences, and yes, some of them have even survived. But, you know, you're also discounting the fact that, you know, if you want information from people, torture is not the way to do it. Because people will say anything under the threat of torture.
And so valuable, in a way that no other resource could ever be. The greatest resource for any human being to control is not natural resources or tools or animals or land, but other human...
I'd beg to disagree on that. But he goes into, okay, other human beings, really.
Beings.
Do tell me more.
You can frighten an animal, because animals are afraid of pain in the moment.
Yes, like humans are.
You cannot frighten an animal with a loss of liberty.
Because they don't have the higher brain functions we do.
Imprisonment in the future. Because animals have very little sense of tomorrow. You cannot threaten a cow with torture or a sheep with death. You cannot swing a sword at a tree and scream at it to produce more fruit, or hold a burning torch to a field and demand more wheat.
What? How is that this? How is it comparing plants and, you know, to the same as animals? That doesn't make any sense.
You cannot get more eggs by threatening a hen, but you can get a man to give you his eggs by threatening him.
Yeah, and you know what? The person who gets threatened has every right to fight back.
This human farming has been the most profitable and destructive occupation throughout history, and it is now reaching its destructive climax.
Really? Why? Why is it reaching a destructive climax? Why is it been so harmful to us? It's, it's been quite useful to us. It's gotten us quite far, this supposed farm.
Human society cannot be rationally understood until it is seen for what it is.
I think the thousands of philosophers and human, sociologists will disagree with you.
A series of farms where human farmers own human livestock. Some people...
Bear in mind, it keeps on saying that, people own people, yet, yes, slavery still goes on in certain parts of the world, but in the Western world, there's no such thing as slavery. In fact, we have laws against slavery. But, we'll get into the end, why this is all bullshit at the end, but, continue.
We'll get confused, because governments provide healthcare and water and education and roads, and thus imagine that there is some benevolence at work.
Because we voted for it. That's why there's such things as this. That's why it happens, unfortunately, but apparently, this guy doesn't seem to understand that. We happen to, vote for health care and other such things that, we want, that would make our society better. But, it's evil somehow.
Nothing could be further from the reality. Farmers provide health care and irrigation.
Yeah, and you know what? They're mandated by the government to do so.
And training to their livestock. Some people get confused because we are allowed certain liberties and thus imagine that our governments protect our freedoms.
And yet, any time those liberties are threatened, you can go to a court of law and a person who has been elected by the government will fight for your liberties.
But farmers plant their crops a certain distance apart to increase their yields, and will allow certain animals larger stalls or fields if it means they will produce more meat and milk. In your country, your tax farm, your farmer...
Oh, he just said this. This is great, because you'll see later on why he suddenly brings up tax farm later on, even though he's mentioned nothing about taxes up until this point.
Grants you certain freedoms, not because he cares about your liberties, but because he wants to increase his profits.
So you're basically saying that a government is a for-profit organisation. How is a government a for-profit organisation when that money is basically returned into the system that they are essentially running?
Are you beginning to see the nature of the cage you were born into?
No, actually, you haven't made a bit of sense at all so far.
There have been 4 major phases of human farming. The first phase in ancient Egypt was direct and brutal human compulsion.
Oh my god.
Human bodies were controlled, but the creative productivity of the human mind remained beyond the reach of the whip.
Right, okay. This is a major, major historical fallacy, right? The slaves in Egypt, right, never existed. People think that slaves built the pyramid. They weren't. They were labourers that were contracted by the government, and they were fed. They even had access to free healthcare, as long as they worked, and they weren't forced to do it. There's been no evidence that they were whipped. This has all been a massive, historical inaccuracy for years, and it's quite funny that they bring this up.
And the brand, and the shackles. Slaves remained woefully underproductive and required enormous resources to control.
As we'll get to later on, in the ancient world, slavery was quite prevalent. Why? Because it was incredibly productive, and people wouldn't have done it if it wasn't productive.
The second phase was the Roman model. wherein slaves were granted some capacity for freedom, ingenuity.
Like what? You're saying they were granted freedoms. What freedoms were they? And as you'll see, he just said, "Oh, they were granted some freedoms." What freedoms?
And creativity, which raised their productivity.
Like what? You're saying, oh, things that raised their, creativity. What? What were they given? You're not telling anything at all. You only have to go look up you only have to go pick up a history book. That's all you have to do. It's a well-known fact. The ancient world had slavery. And that's how the ancient world operated. And as I've said to people before, when you cannot get into a Roman mindset, because people think from, someone who would think, what year is this? Yeah, in 450 AD, no one would think the way that you do now. They would have a vastly different mindset. To them, slavery was okay. It was a natural part of their life. Now, ask anyone, and, slavery is abhorrent to them. No one would want to own a slave.
This increased the wealth of Rome, and thus the tax income of the Roman government.
Yeah, also because the size of the empire also dictated how much land they control, and from that land, they would be able to gain more food, which means they would be able to maintain more soldiers, which meant they could expand their empire even more.
And with this additional wealth, Rome became an empire, destroying the economic freedoms that fed its power.
Yep. Now, as you've seen the full size of the Roman Empire, and yet the slave population for the entire Roman Empire was nothing compared to its actual population. Slavery was a small part of Rome. It's not its entire story. And by telling you that, slavery was the be-all and end-all of the Roman Empire, does a massive comparable damage. Well, go and read a book about the Roman Empire and the things they did, and what, and on the philosophers, and, their learning and their culture. It was just vastly different. You cannot comprehend a Roman mindset.
And collapsed.
Partly because there was massive corruption, the empire had gotten too big. There were other reasons. That it wasn't just this, slavery was the reason why it collapsed. There were massive other reasons.
I'm sure that this does not seem entirely unfamiliar. After the collapse of Rome, the feudal model introduced the concept of livestock ownership and taxation.
No, taxation has existed even in the Roman Empire. Even existed in the Egyptian model you suggested. So I'm still struggling to see any truth or any factual information in what you are seeing and what you are presenting. And you're about to go into the feudal system. So let's see how wrong you can get the feudal system, shall we?
Instead of being directly owned, peasants farmed land that they could retain as long as they paid off the local warlords.
Yes, that is quite true. Well, to a point. Back in the Middle Ages, after the fall of Rome, what happened was the people who owned land got together because they needed to protect themselves from other warlords who were going to come and take over. This in turn ended up coming into, towns turned into cities, cities turned into small states, and then, states eventually turned into nations. Look at what happened in England. There were 3 kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex, and Kent. Or 4. Those were the kingdoms. And they survived because they got together and they farmed and they lived, productively. There was a king at the top who had divine right to rule, because that's how it worked back then in those days. People were still had heavy belief in God. Back in those days, there was no such thing as thinking the world without a God. But, history, right? It's fascinating when you actually learn it.
This model eventually broke down due to the continual subdivision of productive land and was destroyed during the enclosure movement when land was consolidated.
It's still showing medieval imagery, yet this movement happened in the 1700s.
And hundreds of thousands of peasants were kicked off their ancestral lands because...
No, peasants didn't own the land. That was owned by the knight or the lord or the baron, who the peasants would then work for, and then they would have to give a portion of their crops to the lord, to the baron, who would then provide protection, serve as, justice. There's more to the feudal system than this guy wants to say. He's only mentioning the part he wants to say because it proves his, farm point.
As new farming techniques made larger farms more productive with fewer people.
No, if you need... particularly back then, if you had a larger farm, you would need a lot more people.
The increased productivity of the later Middle Ages created the excess food required for the expansion of towns and cities.
Right. One of the reasons why there was a massive, what we call an agricultural revolution, which went hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution, was because people were living more and more in cities. And as a result, they had to come up with new techniques to create more food. New machines were invented. New ways of doing things were invented. You had crop rotation. You had machines like the seed till come in. But again, history, right?
Which in turn gave rise to the modern democratic model of human ownership.
Okay, are we going to ignore the republics that existed then? A lot of them did incredibly well during that time. But, again, history, right?
As displaced peasants flooded into the cities, a huge stock of cheap human capital became available to the rising industrialists. And the ruling class of human farmers quickly realized that they could make more money by letting their livestock choose their own occupations.
By this point, the idea of, peasants was gone by this point. People had a freedom to choose, and they've all, this thing of give them a freedom to choose. Again, this is what the conspiracy side is always telling you. You don't have a freedom of choice. It's a lie to you. Why? Because they want to make you fearful. And this is what this conspiracy side is completely insane. They make people fearful for no other reason than it makes them money.
Under the democratic model, direct slave ownership has been replaced by the mafia model.
Are we not going to mention, why slavery was abolished? Or you're not going to even mention, the French Revolution, where the underclass revolted and got away with, you know, the monarchy and the elite, only for people again to rise to positions of power because people were needed in those positions, and then the peasants revolted again, only for people to rise to those positions who again got killed by the peasants who revolted next.
The mafia rarely owns businesses directly, but rather sends thugs around once a month to steal from the business owners.
Okay, so you're saying that the government steals from businesses when you own a business outright and you have to pay taxes because that's the law. And as you'll see soon enough, there's going to be huge problems with how I'm going to find this eventually, and you'll see. Alright, at the end, it comes, the whole point of this, you'll see. Oh, you'll see.
You are now allowed to choose your own occupation, which raises your productivity, and thus the taxes you can pay.
How? You're saying, oh, it raises your productivity. I know a lot of people who are in jobs that don't want to be in those jobs, but they still do their jobs. You've got to show me something. If this freedom of choice is apparently raising productivity, you've got to show me proof. You've got to show me that we are being given this supposed freedom of choice, yet you show nothing that there's this supposed illusion and this farm metaphor you keep on going about.
To your masters.
Value this time in your life, kids. Because this is the time in your life when you still have your choices. And it goes by so fast. When you're a teenager, you think you can do anything, and you do. Your 20s are a blur. 30s, you raise your family, you make a little money, and you think to yourself, what happened to my 20s? 40s, you grow a little pot belly, you grow another chin. The music starts to
now, I'm pretty sure this clip has been taken out of context, and I'm pretty sure this guy ranting to these children, if you take it in a larger context of the film, I'm not sure which film it's from, I'm pretty sure you'd find there was a larger context in here.
Start eating dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You have lunch around 10, breakfast the night before. Spend most of your time wandering around malls looking for the ultimate soft yogurt and muttering...
Again, it's just convenient for him to put this clip in. Like all the clips have been so far, have been quite manipulative.
Your few freedoms are preserved.
Okay, you just saw a point there of the women's suffrage movement. Are you not telling me that women didn't have to fight for the right to vote and the freedoms that they gained? Because they did. And to say that they didn't is absolutely probably an outright lie and insulting to those original women who fought for all those rights.
Because they are profitable to your owners.
How are they, again, how are they profitable to our owners? Who is our supposed owners? The government? Because, you know, we can vote out people in government and then vote in different people, which happens all the time. But, you know, politics, you know, history, right?
The great challenge of the democratic model is that increases in wealth and freedom threaten the farmers.
No. You've just said, for this entire past thing, that wealth and freedom are good not only for the, you know, cattle, but the farmers as well. That's what you've been saying all this time. That the more wealth and freedom is, the better it is for everyone. And now all of a sudden, it's not.
Ruling classes initially profit from a relatively free market in capital and labour, but as their livestock become more used to their freedoms and growing wealth, they begin to question why they need rulers at all.
Okay, this is the point of the video where I realised what this video actually is. This is a video, and if the political viewpoint is espousing, is libertarianism. And libertarianism basically says you should be free to do whatever the hell you want. In fact, it borders on pretty much anarchy. As I said to any libertarian, if you want to live the libertarian lifestyle, then you want to go to Somalia, where there is very little government, there are no police, virtually no laws, you can pretty much take anything at the point of a gun. But, you know, they still stay in the United States, you know.
Well, nobody ever said that human farming was easy.
You've yet to prove to me that, you know, this human farming actually exists, because all you've spouted so far is nonsense, historical inaccuracies, factual inaccuracies, and political inaccuracies.
Keeping the taxed livestock securely in the compounds of the ruling classes is a three-phase process. The first is to indoctrinate the young through government, quote, education.
Right. Please tell me about this government indoctrination, because surely if it exists in the school systems, you should have a viable example. You should be able to point a camera into a classroom and go, look, that's government indoctrination, right? So I'm expecting to see an example on the screen of this.
As the wealth of democratic countries grew, government schools were universally inflicted in order to control the thoughts and souls of the livestock. The second phase...
Again, I just asked for evidence. You just said. You've just told me something and expected me to take it. Where's your proof that this is happening? You haven't shown me anything.
Is to turn citizens against each other through the creation of dependent livestock.
Right, this isn't a scheme. This is general human nature. People will always disagree with each other. You are never going to get a room of people who completely 100% agree. Even in the conspiracy movement, there are people who do not 100% agree with each other. This is also why we have separate political ideologies.
It is very difficult to rule human beings directly through force, and where it can be achieved, it remains cripplingly underproductive, as can be seen in North Korea.
You bring up North Korea. Anyone with a bit of sense should be able to understand why that is, because no one would accept. Basically, if tomorrow David Cameron came out and said, yeah, we're bringing out the North Korean model, he would be overthrown out of power within seconds of trying to enact that.
Human beings do not breed well or produce efficiently in direct captivity. But if human beings believe that they are free, then they will produce much more for their farmers. The best way to maintain this illusion of freedom is to put some of the livestock on the payroll of the farm.
Okay, this is good, because, again, libertarian point of view, libertarians don't like unions. You know, unions that, you know, fight for the right of workers, that historically have brought better pay, better working conditions. You know, in the US, there are a lot of companies that will not allow their people to unionise. And you've got to ask yourself, that's an even important question. If this person was generally wanted his point to more get across in the farm analogy, should be better asking the point of why do companies like Walmart not allow their employers to unionise in America, but allow their employees elsewhere to unionise?
Farmer. Those cows that become dependent on the existing hierarchy will then attack any other cows who point out the violence, hypocrisy, and immorality of human ownership.
And that is the point where he's basically justified anyone who attacks you for this view, that's the reason they're doing it. It doesn't matter They're just part of the system. Doesn't matter about them. They're wrong, you're right. It doesn't matter. And this is why you'll never get through to people, because that's the viewpoint they take.
Officers positioned Grant face first on the floor with one officer near his head, a second near his back, and a third officer standing nearby. There appeared to be a brief struggle. Then, a 2-year veteran BART officer stands, draws his weapon, and fires.
Freedom is slavery, and slavery is freedom. If
That's not a very good analogy at all, but, you know.
you can get the cows to attack each other whenever anybody brings up the reality of their situation, then you don't have to spend nearly as much controlling them directly.
Yep, again, this is him justifying anyone who attacks this video, that's the why they're doing it.
Of the farmer will violently oppose any questioning of the virtue of human ownership. And the intellectual and artistic classes, always and forever dependent upon the farmers, will say to anyone who demands freedom from ownership, you will harm your fellow cows.
You're not going to give us any better example? No, I guess not. You know, at this point I can't expect less of you, really.
The livestock are thus kept enclosed by shifting the moral responsibility for the destructiveness of a violent system to those who demand real freedom. The third phase is to invent.
You've got to ask what that real freedom is, because, again, what are you asking for? You haven't stated that, and now he's going to start showing pictures of 1984.
Continual external threats, so that the frightened livestock cling to the protection of the farmers. This system of human farming is now nearing its end.
Okay, tell me how it's nearing its end.
The terrible tragedies of modern Western economic systems has occurred not in spite of, but because of past economic freedoms.
Not really. It really happened because a lot of the governments, particularly during the 80s, deregulated a lot of the systems that kept the organisations in check. But, you know, history, right?
The massive increases in Western wealth throughout the 19th century resulted from economic freedoms. And it was this very increase in wealth that fed...
Also, yeah, this is going to... again, he's not going to bring this up, but, you know, there were economic crashes during the 19th century, you know.
The size and power of the state. Whenever the livestock become exponentially more productive, you get a corresponding increase in the number of farmers and their dependents. The growth of the state is always proportional to the preceding economic freedoms. Economic freedoms create wealth, and the wealth attracts more thieves and political parasites, whose greed then destroys the economic freedoms.
Are you going to give me an example?
In other words, freedom metastasizes the cancer of the
Are you going to give me an example?
state. The government that starts off the smallest will always end up the largest.
Do you know why? Because people want more things from a government. And then a government has to accommodate that because that's what people want. But, you know, politics, right?
This is why there can be no viable and sustainable alternative to a truly free and peaceful society. A society without political rulers, without human ownership.
Again, this is a massive libertarian viewpoint of, we don't need anyone to rule us, we don't need anyone like that. And yet, again, I point to the French Revolution, where the people who enacted the first French Revolution, when people grew disgruntled with them, they went on the chopping block. And when it was just an endless cycle. And it happened again and again and again until Napoleon came into power. But you know, history, right?
Without the violence of taxation and statism.
Oh, the violence of taxation.
To be truly free is both very easy and very hard. We avoid the horror of our enslavement because it is so painful to see it directly. We dance around the endless violence of our dying system because we fear the attacks of our fellow livestock. But we can only be kept in the cages we refuse to see. Wake up. To see the farm is to leave it.
God. Alright. And as you can see, what was that last part? All that part was doing was be afraid, be very afraid. That's what I want you to be, because if you're afraid, you'll give me money, because if you give me money, I can continue to research the New World Order. Do you not see how... This is the best part, because I've just realised this. Do these people not see, who think this is true, can they not see how enslaved they are by their own fear of people like this who put fear into them? Do they care? No, because they're idiots. And of course, as that video you just saw, anyone who talks out against you, they're just part of that system. So people will adopt that mindset. And I have come across this thousands and thousands of times. I can literally point them to, you know, papers, folders, the actual, you know, documents. They don't care. Oh.